Good morning, everyone, and Shavua Tov, and welcome to our first health conversation of 2021. And as always, with activities and programs that we do at Emanuel Synagogue, we want to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of this land on which, from which we broadcast here in Sydney, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and of course in Melbourne, where Tanya and Peter are, and I'll introduce them shortly, the Wurundjeri people in the land of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge that over time, European settlement intentionally and consequentially displaced indigenous peoples from their land, disempowered them, and greatly destroyed their culture, while they never ceded their sovereignty over the land. We acknowledge that to heal the wounds of the First Nations of this land, we must empower their voice within the Australian Constitution, learn the truth of our intertwined history, and reach treaties to share equitably the bounty of this land. And so with that acknowledgement, I also want to acknowledge that we are here this morning with esteemed guests to lead a conversation on something that is very important. And I'm going to set the scene by referring back to an article. We were hoping to do this last year in 2020, and just circumstances deferred it until now. But now, of course, we will hear it's extremely timely conversation. But back in April of 2020, Tanya and Andrew Robb, who had been Minister for Trade, Investment and Tourism in the government, and himself has suffered with depression, jointly wrote this article in the Saturday paper. And I just quote from parts of it. Before the coronavirus pandemic, 1 in 5 Australian adults was already experiencing a chronic mental health condition. 1 in 8 and 1 in 4 older adults was using antidepressants, and on average, 8 Australians took their own lives each day. So these are terrible statistics, stark realities that saw Australia experience the second highest prevalence of depression in the world, tied with Estonia and the United States, according to the World Health Organization. But even these numbers fail to capture everything: the untold personal and family suffering, the enormous costs to our economy. They will never do justice to the heartache, suffering, and community damage. So the development of a government strategy to tackle the burgeoning mental health crisis needs to include the evaluation and possible introduction of new and innovative treatment options. Innovation is needed because remission rates for people experiencing depression are only about 35% when using the standard treatments of antidepressants and psychotherapy. And the remission rates for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are even lower, about 20% of sufferers. And so we will hear about Mind Medicine Australia that was formed with a view to this history. And so I may be stealing a little bit of the thunder, but I just want to acknowledge in the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy was regarded by psychiatrists as the next big breakthrough. And these medicines were used to successfully treat more than 40,000 patients for a variety of conditions. But then in the 70s, during Richard Nixon's war on drugs, and there's a lot to be said about that, these substances were criminalized for political reasons. Partly to suppress the anti-war movement. And we can actually even see as well, there's a fabulous documentary, 13th, that points out that there was also part of a racial profiling going on there. Within that, the study of psychedelics halted, as did their role in tackling very thorny mental health conditions. Professor David Nutt, head of neuropsychopharmacology at London's Imperial College, describes this as, quote, the worst censorship of research and medical treatment in the history of humanity. And before we go on and say, but whoa, we're getting into dangerous territory, I'd like to put this in a Jewish context. And here we talk about the body. The first bracha that we say in the morning is the blessing for the health and well-being of our body. And the understanding is that as we are part of one creation, we use the idea that God created the entire universe, and therefore our body is a gift from the heavens beyond. It is our responsibility to take care of that, just like it is to take care of our planet and the environment. And so within this care of health, we need proper exercise and diet and sleep and all those kinds of things. That's part of our responsibility. Part of our responsibility is also to avoid things that will endanger us and damage us. And yet, the Talmud also recognizes that life is about risk management. Even driving is a risk, flying is a risk. Everything that we do has a risk attached to it. And so the Talmud talks about the way that we manage that, which is obviously through experience and knowledge. Now, when we come specifically to the question of substances, we know that Judaism is not against the use of certain things to improve our condition. Psalm 104, of course, has that famous line, wine gladdens the heart. And now we know that while there is that notion, and how many of us will say l'chaim when we have a little drink, and that this is part of the health and the joy of life itself. And of course, this week we're going to be celebrating Purim, and we know that there is the tradition of drinking. On one hand, the tradition also says to overdo things is actually where we are endangering and transgressing. And therefore drunkenness is condemned, beginning with the story of Noah. So things that we know do cause danger must be shunned. And this is actually why in Judaism, new halachot condemn smoking and the endangering of others through secondhand tobacco smoke. Judaism is about following the science, the knowledge, the experience, but there is no prohibition on the use of either alcohol or other substances that we sometimes call drugs and sometimes call medicines in Judaism. Putting on one last other hat, many of you know from a previous health conversation that I'm an advocate of the Australian Drug Law Reform Foundation. And this is a new move throughout the Jewish world that understands that this war on drugs does not work and that we are about justice. Justice shall we pursue. So it's about justice in terms of a war on drugs does not work, knowledge and science-based evidence in terms of making sure that we have healthy bodies and healthy minds. I'm sure that Peter and Tanya will address some of the important research that has been done in the last couple of years in Johns Hopkins, changes in Oregon, in London through their Center for Psychedelic Research. And so with that, I want to turn over to them. Tanya DeJong AM is a trailblazing Australian soprano, award-winning social entrepreneur, creative innovation analyst, spiritual journey woman, storyteller, and global speaker, one of Australia's most successful female entrepreneurs, having developed 6 businesses and 3 charities over 3 decades. Recently, with Peter, she co-founded Mind Medicine Australia to help alleviate the suffering caused by mental illness in Australia through expanding the treatment options available to medical practitioners and their patients. Mind Medicine Australia is establishing safe and effective psychedelic-assisted treatments to treat a range of mental illnesses. Now, Tanya was appointed a member of the Order of Australia and AM in June 2008 for services to the arts as a performer and entrepreneur, and through the establishment and development of music and arts enrichment programs for schools and communities. She has a Bachelor of Law honors from the University of Melbourne, a graduate of the Victorian College of the Arts in Opera, Music, Theatre, and Voice. And I love this. Her grandmother invented the foldable umbrella in Vienna in 1929. So it's not surprising innovation is in her blood. Her mother, we recently heard from last year in one of our programs on Daenerys, she had that connection. Tanya's mission is to change the world one voice at a time. And not long ago, she and Peter met and married through a trip to Israel, which is a fabulous way to make a connection. And Peter is an investment banker who advised local and multinational companies and governments in Australia for nearly 35 years, co-founder and executive chairman of one of Australia's leading investment banking advisory firms, Caliber Partnership, which is now called Greenhill Australia. He's an active philanthropist involved in funding, developing and scaling social sector organizations which seek to create a better and fairer world. He is chairman of Mind Medicine Australia, and he also founded in 2011 the Women's Community Shelter and remains on its board. There are many other things that he has done, and for this was made a member of the General Division of the Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2010 for services to the philanthropic sector. So it's with great honor and privilege we get to hear from first Tanya de Jong, AM, and Peter Hunt, AM, from Mind Medicine Australia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, for so beautifully contextualizing what we're going to talk about today. Because you're dead right. It's not the substance that's the problem. It's whether you use it for good or whether you abuse the substance. And here we're very much talking about using these substances in medically controlled environments where all the data shows that they're safe and non-addictive, and they can lead to extraordinarily high remission rates with mental illness. There is in Australia this great paradox that, we live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We have a first-class health system. The governments and individuals pour a huge amount of money into health, and yet we have some of the worst, as you mentioned, Rabbi, some of the worst mental health statistics in the world. There's an elephant in the room when you start talking about mental illness, which isn't acknowledged enough in Australia. We have a series of government commissions which talk about the need to improve processes, to put the patient right in the centre of the system where the patient should be, to improve patient access gateways. But the real elephant in the room is that our treatments actually aren't very good. They help some people, but they don't help a large number of other people. And it's that which we're going to talk about today. In terms of introducing you to the concept of psychedelic assisted therapy, we've got a short, like a 3-minute video, which really explains the context, I think, pretty well. So do you want to get the video on?
$1 billion a year. I can't sleep. Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
I can't sleep. Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. Subject to forthcoming clinical trial results, we will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Okay, we might move straight into the presentation. Just get it on the screen. All right, we'll move through this quite quickly, and we'll just start with the scale of the mental health problem in Australia, which the rabbi talked about. You know, that 1 in 5 Australians with a chronic mental health condition, the dramatic overuse of antidepressants, which is only getting worse. And bear in mind, the science of antidepressants is about 50 years old, and 1 in 2 Australians likely to have a mental illness in their lifetimes. We've listed below some of the major mental illnesses that we see, you know, PTSD, other anxiety disorders, depression, and substance use disorders. And we've listed those because they just happen to be the mental illnesses that these therapies have been most trialled with and are showing, as we mentioned before, remarkable remission rates. When you look at the Australian general population, the stats are bad enough, but when you look at particular discrete groups within the Australian population, the stats are truly dreadful. And the one that's often referred to is Australian Defence Force veterans, where, as you'll see, the mental illness rates are much, much higher, and that leads to a higher level of suicide and also a high level of comorbidity, so they have multiple problems. Those bad statistics also apply to other discrete groups, such as first responders, you know, ambulance people, fire brigade people, people in the police force, all of whom have particularly high rates of PTSD. The cost to Australia of this, in terms of personal anguish and economic cost, is truly enormous. You know, that 1 in 5 doesn't actually tell the complete picture, because it's obviously not just the sufferer, it's the family members around that sufferer who have to deal with the mental illness. Mental illness also then leads to higher levels of unemployment. It's a primary cause of many of our entrenched social problems like domestic violence and homelessness. And it obviously is a primary cause of suicide. Listed down at the bottom of this slide, the economic costs, which are truly enormous. We think this is way beyond economic cost, but the reason we put them there is that if we can actually get more people well and out of the system, that will relieve a significant amount of resources to hopefully support people with mental illnesses which can't be addressed by these particular therapies. This is the elephant in the room that I spoke about earlier. There really has been no scalable treatment innovation in this sector for 50 years. You know, the last was really in the 1960s, early 1970s, when antidepressants came in. The science of antidepressants is 50 years old. As the rabbi mentioned with depression, if you've got depression, you've probably got a 35% chance of getting well through the current system, either with pharmaceuticals or psychotherapy, or a mixture of the two. Whilst the response rates are higher, response rates don't mean you get well. And as a society, we want people to get well and out of the mental health system. The other great problem with the current pharmaceuticals is that the relapse rate is really high when you come off them, and they can often lead to some really nasty side effects. And we've listed some of the side effects on this slide. When you move from depression into PTSD, the numbers are truly terrible, because you're only getting response rates from current treatments of somewhere between 20 and 30%. But the true statistic is remission rates, where you're seeing remission rates as low as 5%. So, people who have PTSD in our society, they don't have a great chance of being helped in terms of getting well through the current modalities. So that's the big comment I'd make down the bottom, that if we just continue with the way we're doing it at present and just put more resources into the system, improve patient access gateways, do all the process stuff, we will never solve this problem. It'll just be more of the same, and the results won't improve. So with that, Tanya?
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. Just continuing on from what Peter said, Mind Medicine Australia is a charity. Our goal is to help expand the treatment options available to practitioners and their patients to help alleviate incredible suffering of so many millions of people in this country. Our focus at the moment is on medicinal psilocybin for depression and medicinal MDMA for PTSD. We're also interested in other psychedelic medicines, many of which are being studied in some of the leading universities around the world. For us, success means that these therapies become an integrated part of the mental health system, leading to high remission rates, and that they're accessible and affordable to all Australians in need. We've put together a board of very influential and experienced people across a range of sectors, including the former head of the Armed Forces, Chris Barry, Jane Burns, the head of mental health at Swinburne, Dr. Ali Kotler, who's a leading psychiatrist specialising in trauma and addiction, Dr. Simon Longstaff, the head of the Ethics Centre, who says that it's unethical for these medicines not to be made available to Australians who are suffering in medically controlled environments. And Andrew Robb, that the rabbi mentioned earlier, who's been suffering with treatment-resistant depression for 43 years. A team as well, and then we have some of the leading ambassadors in the world. These are the leading researchers in this space who have led and dedicated their lives to this field in the hope that these medicines can be made available to as many people around the world as possible to help alleviate the suffering. Then we have an advisory panel of extraordinary, many psychiatrists, over 20 psychiatrists, GPs, other emergency specialists and physicians, psychologists, other researchers in behavioural science, pharmacologists, religious leaders, lawmakers, natural medicine, really across the whole gamut of different sectors who are passionate about improving the mental health of our community, anthropologists and so on. So we're focused particularly, as I said, on medicinal psilocybin and medicinal MDMA. And the remarkable thing about these medicines is that they only require 2 to 3 medicinal sessions alongside a short course of psychotherapy. That's against, for many patients, a lifetime of pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy treatments, in many cases that only at best manage the patient's illness. They don't actually lead to remission. These medicines, on the other hand, are curative. They lead to remissions in 60 to 80% of patients. And there's been, just in recent years, over 3,000 patients that have gone through trials, and the remission rates have really been outstanding. The medicines are also considered very safe in a medically controlled environment. They're non-addictive. And they've been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA in the USA to fast-track the approval process. This designation is only given to medicines that could be vastly superior to existing treatments. The medicines are also administered in medically controlled environments, as we've reiterated, and there's 3 stages to the treatment. The first stage is the screening, so it's very important to say that these treatments do not suit every single patient, just like no treatment suits every single patient. So it's important that at the moment, for example, patients with psychosis are screened out, as patients with psychosis are screened out from certain other medications also. So the patient then gets to know the therapist explains to them what will occur in the medicinal sessions. The medicinal sessions, as I mentioned, there's usually 2 or 3. In the case of psilocybin in the trials, there's been 2. In the case of MDMA, 3. The medicinal sessions for many patients are described as the most meaningful experience, one of the most meaningful experiences in their lives because of the sense of oneness, of connection, of warmth and love, connection to self, to others, and to nature. Coming out of that, integration is critical. So the integration phase of this treatment is very important. So that's why these treatments are called psychedelic assisted therapies. They're not just a medicine on their own, nor are they just a psychotherapy on their own. It's the combination of the two that makes this paradigm of treatment quite unique and is not the way in general that most patients are being treated today, which is why we're not experiencing good remission rates from current treatments. So here's some of the safety outcomes again. There's a patient undergoing the treatment. So you can see that they've got an eye mask on. They're lying there with headphones, listening to a beautiful playlist. It's in a clinic, but it's been made to look more comfortable. 2 therapists there looking after and supporting the patient. Interestingly as well, you see this relative drug harm chart, which shows even in recreational environments, the relative safety of both MDMA and psilocybin. You can see that they're considered the most safe pretty much of all drugs. Yet on the other end of the scale, you see alcohol, which in the blue there, most dark blue, most harm to self, and pale blue, harm to others. So alcohol, whilst fully legal at the highest volumes, unregulated. And then, of course, you have these extremely beneficial medicines down the other end, which have been vilified. Some patient testimonials from those who've used these medicines. I felt like I went through 15 years of psychological therapy in one night. So we not only see there the potential for incredible healing of the patients, but also enormous cost savings that would be possible through use of these medicines because the treatment course is so short. The effect sizes of the treatments are also remarkable. So the normal effect size for an antidepressant on the Cohen's D scale is about 0.3. Psilocybin for depression, on the other hand, is getting rates of 2.0 to 3.1. So an effect size 7 to 10 times more than antidepressants. You also see MDMA there for PTSD, which is 4 to 5 times more effective than current existing treatments. So what's happening? What's happening when patients are using these medicines? Well, particularly in the case of psilocybin, it said that psilocybin helps alter communication between brain networks, helping to bypass what is known as the default mode network. The default mode network is what keeps us stuck in our programs and patterns and repetitive thought loops. I'm not good enough, things won't work out, and so on. They keep us stuck and mean that our brain is really not maximizing its neural connectivity. And you see that in these representations of fMRI scans on the right here, these 2 circle diagrams. On the far right, you see a diagram of a person who is suffering from depression. They haven't had any intervention with these medicines. So you can see the pretty limited thought loops there. On the other hand, you see the intervention with the psilocybin in the left circle, where you see this increased and massive neurogenesis of neural pathways. You see an increase in neuroplasticity, reconnection of some old and damaged pathways, and the hemispheres starting to talk to one another again. That is really remarkable and creates that sense of connectivity. And I think, as many of us know, one of the definitions of depression is a sense of disconnection. And in fact, many people say that the real cause of depression is a sense of disconnection. It's not actually, in many cases, brain chemistry that's out of whack. It's a sense of separation and isolation that the patient is feeling. Some people describe the way these medicines work as resetting or rebooting the brain, defragging the dodgy drive, allowing the patient to start over again to create and set a template for more positive ways of coping with their illness and getting better themselves rather than taking medicines for the rest of their lives, so that mental illness no longer needs to be a life sentence. The other remarkable thing about these medicines is that they lead to increased remissions over time, which is something that current treatments certainly don't. So with current treatments, you might get an initial spike from using an antidepressant. That may then plateau, then the medical practitioner may double the dose, increase it, change it because it stops working. And I'm sure that many of us know many people who've tried maybe 10 or even 12 or more medications over a period of time to try and find the one that works. So you can see here these increasing remissions with these medications, which is a really remarkable feature of the medications. As well, and actually, yeah, I'll come back on those results, but that particular slide I just passed by was a New York University trial study which was showing results from an end-of-life study for patients with a terminal cancer diagnosis. And 80% of those patients went into remission at the end of that trial. Well, the remarkable thing about that is 4.5 years later, last year, they went back to those patients, and not only were the majority of those patients still alive, even though they had a terminal diagnosis, but all of them were still in remission as well. You see here as well a slide on medicinal MDMA treatment for PTSD. PTSD is one of the hardest conditions to treat. And actually, now studies are showing that only a maximum of 5% of patients with PTSD are going into remission with current treatments. It's important to say that MDMA is not ecstasy. Ecstasy is a street drug, often adulterated, so that young people getting MDMA on the street or ecstasy on the street don't necessarily know what's in the capsule. When combined with alcohol and dehydration at a party or a rave or a concert, that can lead to terrible outcomes if a young person doesn't know what's in the medication capsule. So unfortunately, quite a lot of the capsules sold on the street don't even have MDMA in them at all, let alone pure pharmaceutical grade MDMA, which is what we're talking about. It's also important to say that obviously these medicines would never be taken home by patients. These treatments occur entirely in clinics under the supervision of trained practitioners. But MDMA does decrease fear and defensiveness in its pure form in a medical environment, while increasing empathy, trust, and safety. It stops the fight or flight of the amygdala, which is associated with traumatic memory. So normally speaking, in normal therapies, when a practitioner is trying to encourage a patient to talk about their trauma, the patient will often be re-traumatized or re-triggered by talking about the trauma, which means it's pretty hard for the patient to get better because they get stuck at where their trauma occurred. You can see here these outstanding results. In a MAPS phase 2 trial, there were 105 participants, all with treatment-resistant PTSD for an average of 18 years. So you can imagine the suffering. After just 3 treatments of MDMA therapy combined with psychotherapy, 52% went into remission immediately and 68% at the end of the 12-month follow-up. That is against a 5% remission rate with current existing treatments. These results have been so prospective that MDMA is now in phase 3 trials in multi-sites, 15 multi-sites around the world. And there's a 90% expectation of probability that these medicines will become prescribable in the US within the next 12 to 18 months. In the video, we showed that these medicines are also now being trialled for dementia, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia and other eating disorders, a range of addictions, and even cluster headaches. They're also now available through expanded access schemes. In Australia, that's called the SASB scheme. A number of psychiatrists and doctors, prescribing doctors in Australia, have started receiving TGA approvals to treat patients through our SASB pathway to enable those patients who have treatment-resistant depression and PTSD a chance to get better, which is very exciting. At the moment, the TGA is providing federal approvals, but each state has different laws around the use of Schedule 9 substances, which is why Peter and I and MMA have put in applications to the TGA for the rescheduling of these medicines to Schedule 8 controlled medicines. Absolutely fundamental that these medicines get recognised as medicines rather than as prohibited drugs. They should never have been scheduled to begin with, and as the rabbi mentioned, we'll just briefly cover their history. So now we're seeing also around the world that these medicines are being decriminalised, and they're also being legalised for therapeutic use in a number of states in the USA. The Canadian government has recently provided exemptions so that patients with a terminal illness can be treated with psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to help ease their anxiety, and the German government are also investing an enormous amount in this field. They're being studied in the leading institutions around the world, Harvard, Oxford, Yale, Imperial College, and so on. And Johns Hopkins, of course, a leader in this space, and now Monash University. There have also been centres of excellence set up around the world, Imperial College, Johns Hopkins, Berkeley, Shepherd Pratt, and just recently at the Mount Sinai School, where there's a focus on veterans and first responders' mental health, which is particularly bad. So what has happened here is that these medicines have been with us since the beginning of humanity. They were used in ancient Greek and Roman times, and the archaeology proves that conclusively. And they've been used in many ancient tribes for healing and raising of consciousness all along the way. Unfortunately, in the 1950s and 60s, as we saw, over 40,000 patients took part in healing sessions with these medicines under therapeutic conditions, and they were considered the next big thing in psychiatry. And you can see there Dr. Stan Grof, a leading psychiatrist, saying psychedelics would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. Unfortunately, in 1970, Nixon had his war on drugs, and the only way he could really conscript the hippies and blacks back into his war movement, in his Vietnam War movement, was to arrest their leaders, and the only way he could do that was for drug issues. So his entire reason for criminalising the use of these medicines was political. It was not based on science. And you can see there one of his senior aides saying, "Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Unfortunately, that prohibition meant that not only was all use criminalised, but unfortunately all research funding pretty much stopped at that point in time, and has only just really resurfaced over the last decade to 15 years, where you now see this incredible renaissance of studies in this field, over 150 current or recently completed trials, particularly in MDMA and psilocybin, but you're also starting to see a lot of research taking place with other medicines in this class. The other thing that we're seeing is an extraordinary proliferation of for-profit companies around the globe. When Peter and I launched Mind Medicine Australia, there was only one, which is now worth nearly $2 billion. But each week or two, we see new for-profit companies emerging around the world who are looking at development of the molecules, manufacturing and agribusiness, and the rollout of clinics globally. So it's quite remarkable when you see that, and this is only a snapshot of some. Our strategy is to build the ecosystem for these medicines to be made available in Australia. We do that through a range of events such as this one, and we're very grateful to the Synagogue for its support and its visionary leadership in sharing this information. And we have a lot of organisations around Australia who invite us to co-present at their webinars, ranging from, you know, think tanks like the Australia Institute to Delmont Private Hospital, a leading psychiatric hospital, through to associations like ACNEM or AMA, the Australian Medical Lifestyle Foundation. And we're speaking to a range not only of medical practitioners all the time, but the general public. We also have a wonderful free webinar series where we have people like Dr. Gabor Mate speaking this Tuesday, with over 2,000 people registered for that event, and tickets are still available. That's a free webinar. And coming up soon, we also have some other really interesting webinars as well. We also have a major international medical summit in November, featuring some of the leading researchers and doctors in this space coming to Melbourne. And we've started state and regional chapters. So some of the people on this call are from Sydney. We have a state chapter there and many other chapters in New South Wales and all over Australia to educate and inform their local communities. We've also started the first ever certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies in the Southern Hemisphere. That commenced a few weeks ago and has a full intake of psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, physicians, other specialist practitioners, social workers, psychotherapists, drug and alcohol specialists, occupational therapists, and so on. Our second intake starts in July, and it's also nearly full. So if you're a therapist out there and you're thinking, oh, I'd really like to have some skills in this space as well, then please inquire and register for the course. We also have intakes planned for next year, and we'll plan to roll out that training further. We're also looking at setting up a Centre of Excellence, an Asia Pacific Centre in Emerging Mental Health Therapies, in combination with some universities in Australia, and those talks are far advanced, and that will be for applied research and development in Australia, development of supply chains and manufacturing of these medicines in Australia, rollout of clinics and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also looking at the preferred legal and ethical frameworks in this space, rescheduling. We also have a psychological support service to provide support to patients in Australia who are using these medicines. So while we don't advocate for use outside of medical environments, inevitably, because patients cannot get access to these medicines in medically controlled environments, they're going underground to access treatments in this space because they want to get better. Tim Ferriss, who's one of the great investors and donors in this space, says this is an extraordinary opportunity to affect millions of lives. And we urge all of you on this call to share this important work and to donate to this space, because this is the best chance that we have of actually getting a lot more people well from treatment-resistant mental illnesses. And there is avoidable suffering. And if there's avoidable suffering, we need to do everything we can to ensure that people have a chance to get better. So how can you help us? Start conversations. We have a wonderful Learn area on our website, mindmedicineaustralia.org. Join our chapters, volunteer, talk to your doctors and medical professionals. Please donate. We're philanthropists, but we can't do this alone. Follow us on social media, talk to your local MPs, attend our events, our webinars, our summit. Here's our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies, our psychological support service that provides support to those of you who need it. You also have an opportunity to comment on the rescheduling decisions. So on the 4th of March, is the final chance to comment on the TGA's interim decision, which was not to reschedule these medicines, in spite of the fact that in Schedules 4 and 8 are far more dangerous medicines than these medicines. And the TGA, unfortunately, have provided a number of reasons or not rescheduling, which are not based on the science and the data. So unfortunately, there's still a lot of prejudice in this space, and that's why we do these webinars, to focus on science and facts rather than carrying legacy history from 50 or 60 years ago. It seems bizarre that in this day and age, we should still be ruled by stigma from 50 or 60 years ago by a president's edicts that was not based on science to begin with. This is our summit taking place in November in Melbourne. We invite all of you to come and hope that you can be there, and a 10% discount for anyone from the community of Emanuel using the password MMA 2021 ticket, discounts off any tickets to the summit. And then upcoming events, as I mentioned on Tuesday, Dr. Gabor Mate, one of the leading trauma and addiction specialists in the world. Also note there on the 24th of March, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, the most cited researcher in this space, who's the lead investigator of a trial at Imperial College, which is investigating psilocybin versus SSRIs. So psilocybin versus antidepressants directly on 60 patients, not only the effects, but also the side effects. So that's going to be quite fascinating, and he'll be talking about the final results of that trial. Dr. Gabby Agin-Libes from New York is also going to be speaking about psilocybin for end of life and so on. So that's it from us for now until the Q&A, and very much looking forward to hearing from Josephine and then answering your questions.
Tanya, thank you so much. Peter, thank you very, very much. So much to continue learning. And so at this point, what I'd like to do, as Tanya mentioned, is introduce our next speaker. Dr. Josephine Anderson is a conjoint associate professor at the University of New South Wales and clinical director at the Royal Far West Centre for Country Kids in Manly. She also works as a consultant psychiatrist for the New South Wales Mental Health Review Tribunal and has been very involved at the Black Dog Institute and the Early Psychosis Program in Southeast Sydney Local Health District. While Dr. Anderson's work is primarily clinical, she has a keen interest in teaching and service development with a focus on early intervention, innovative models of care and service integration, including embracing partnership with GPs and NGO care providers. So Dr. Anderson, we look forward to your insights on these important issues. Thanks, over to you.
Thanks, Jeffrey, and I hope you can hear me okay? Yep.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for attending. This is a very exciting and interesting area of medicine. There's no doubt about that. I just wanted to make a disclaimer. I do work for a number of different organisations, and for about 6 years I was clinical director at the Black Dog Institute, which is also a research institute into mood disorders primarily. But I'm not speaking on behalf of any of those organisations today. I'm speaking as a clinician. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training, and I've been that for about the last 30 years. So look, it was very interesting to listen to Tanya and Peter. I just wanted to put in a number of caveats, possibly from my own perspective in the reading of literature, just about the incidence and prevalence of depression. Depression certainly is very common in Australia. I commonly tell my patients that about 15% of us will experience a serious episode of clinical depression at some time or other in our lives. So that means we all either have it or we know somebody who's going to have an episode of depression. But how well that depression responds to treatment is a little bit dependent on definitions of severity. Depression is an episodic illness by and large. It typically can last a few months untreated to several years, and people certainly suffer during that time. And a small proportion of people will go on to have a much more chronic and relapsing kind of picture. It's probably fair to say, I think most of the science would agree, that around about 2/3 of people will not in fact respond to the first antidepressant that they are prescribed. However, as Peter and Tanya pointed out, there are many, many antidepressants, so it's not unusual for people to trial a second or even a third antidepressant before they get a good response, what they would regard as a good response. That still does leave, however, depending on where one reads, about between 10 and 30% of people with what we would describe as difficult to treat depression. So they're often described as people who have not had a good response to 2 or more different trials of different kinds of antidepressant medications. So I just wanted to lay that information before people, just to let you know that that is typically how a clinician of my experience in treating depression would be thinking about prevalence. The second thing I would like to say, and this is part in my particular interest, which is in early intervention. I know we've been talking about possibly the more difficult to treat end of the depressive disorders, but we do know from our experience in medicine generally and in psychiatry in particular, that if we intervene early in the course of an illness, then we are much more likely to get a better response and a more rapid response to treatment across the board, whatever that might be. So places such as the Black Dog Institute and many other research institutes have been focusing on not only how can we help people, in some studies as many as 60% of people with serious depression or anxiety disorders who can't access treatment, any kind of treatment for their disorders. How can we help them to access treatment more readily? And over the last 10 years, we've developed a number of very strongly evidence-based interventions for anxiety and depression, which are usually available free, or at least when referred by a GP online, so making them much more accessible. And we haven't talked much about psychotherapies today, but psychotherapies are by and large the first line of treatment for a range of disorders, including most of the depressions, not so much the melancholic or psychotic depressions, but certainly the more common depressions and also the more common anxiety disorders. So I just wanted to make that point as well. The other point I'd make is that it's not quite true to say that there's only been, sometimes one would agree, not terribly exciting developments in medications for depression over the last 30 or 40 years. There's been some very interesting developments in physical treatments for depression, building on the excellent and very long-standing evidence for ECT, physical treatments that don't require general anaesthetic and that can be delivered in the outpatient clinical setting have been devised and have a very strong evidence base behind them now. One of these I'm quite familiar with because I helped to set up the first outpatient access to it in New South Wales at the Black Dog Institute in 2014. The work of Professor Colleen Liu made that possible, and indeed Colleen went on to lead that first clinic for RTMS, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, in New South Wales. So that's a little bit of history about that as well. One thing that I, getting more directly to what Tanya and Peter were talking about, there's a couple of points that I wanted to make. I do find actually, as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, the interest in the use of MDMA in medication-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD very interesting. I know that some of the work that's being done in London is looking at this, and particularly around people who are now older adolescents or adults, but who have been significantly traumatised as children. I know Ben Sesser and his colleagues are having some very interesting and promising results from the use of MDMA to enable people to engage in what is a very strongly evidence-based psychotherapy for PTSD, that's trauma-focused PTSD, enabling that, that group who were otherwise unable because of the severity of their symptoms to engage in that psychological therapy. So that's certainly a very interesting space to watch. I suppose the other thing that I was interested in, though, was the psychotherapeutic aspect of what Tanya and Peter have been talking about in the use of psilocybin and MDMA more generally, but thinking about the use of psilocybin in assisting treatment for difficult to treat depression in particular. I think that sometimes over the years, in my experience, and certainly in the history of psychiatry, psychotherapies have often been perhaps overlooked as not being as beneficial or as powerful as medicinal therapies, and there's plenty of evidence to show that that's not the case. But secondly, they've often been overlooked in being studied because it's regarded that they can do no harm. Now, actually, anything that we try to engage patients with by way of therapy can do harm. And I would be very interested to hear about the way in which the psychotherapy part of the assisted treatment has been packaged. And I note that Tanya said there's a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapy available for their trainees. And I would really, you may have already submitted for publication the evaluation of that side in terms of safety and efficacy, which I think would be very, very doable. But manualising, you know, the psychotherapy side of it, I noticed that people who come from a range of different health training backgrounds, but who've been trained in various different kinds of psychotherapies, are invited to join and to be students in that program. So I would imagine that there is some plan to manualise the particular components that are deemed to be important, and also if there were any publications you could point me to about that, that would be great too. I don't think I have anything more to add. I think the breakthrough designation of the psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in treatment of difficult to treat depression in the States is promising. It still does mean there's some time to come. I was listening to the author of the recent article of Ron Griffiths, I think it was, being interviewed by Norman Swan recently, and when put on the spot, he thought it would be about 3 or 4 years before, if all went well and the results of the RCT, which are much larger scale, proved to be positive. It would be about 3 or 4 years before they were actually ready to roll in a clinical sense for the population at large. But who knows, things might happen more quickly than that. Certainly in the last 12 months, things have happened more quickly than we would otherwise expect as far as vaccinations and so forth. So I think I'll probably finish there, I think, Jeffrey, and leave it open for people to chat or ask me questions.
Yeah. Josie, thank you so much for your insight. Someone in the Q&A had said, you know, they wanted to hear what a clinician would think. And so that was part of this, is to make sure that we had someone who, you know, was able to speak about that. I've been jotting down a few of the questions, and one of them had to do with the difference between how this is being used, that is to say, the early research into psychedelic for PTSD, depression, and things like that, compared to how medical marijuana is also being explored for its use. Obviously, they're for different things, but just to address that.
Yes, so look, I think I can only really speak in very general terms about that. I'm not, and I don't specialise in alcohol and other drug psychiatry, but obviously I've been, following as a clinician the developments in that. The process is that in Australia, any medications that are eventually going to be approved for use for the general population for particular indications has to be approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the Australian version of the FDA. The Therapeutic Goods Administration, on the whole, I think most people would agree, certainly most clinicians would agree, is a justifiably cautious organisation, which doesn't mean to say that they don't collect a good deal of data from as many sources as are relevant and sift through that data. I think that many of us from time to time in our long clinical lives would have said, gosh, it would be really good if we could have that. They have it in Britain, they have it in America, whatever it is. Why can't we have it here? However, there are also, stories that would have well known to all of us of times when the TGA, in its careful and methodical way, has in fact shielded us from the highly undesirable effects of some medications, which may in fact be very efficacious. In my own area of work as a psychiatrist, clozapine is an example of that. Clozapine is a very good antipsychotic. It's now widely available for prescribing under certain circumstances, and it's a very effective antipsychotic. However, when it was first brought out, it was released fairly quickly in the United States and Europe, and was shown to have considerable beneficial effects for people with very difficult to treat schizophrenia. However, about a year after that happened and people were getting terrific results from it, people started dropping dead from the side effects of medication. And it wasn't until then that its effects on cardiac function and also its effects on the white blood cells in the bone marrow were discovered. And so we didn't experience any of that because in fact it wasn't available yet. The TGA was still working through its processes. So that's just an example. There are lots of examples like that. So getting back to the question about cannabis and the psychedelic medications, that is the process. So that's what the TGA will do. It generally likes to see not only good evidence in the research for obviously safety and effectiveness, and that means fairly large scale trials usually in other countries, but it also likes to see at least some replication of some of that work in Australia. I can't speak from the point of view of registration of medicines, but I did have some knowledge about the experience with repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, because there was a body of evidence from Professor Liu and many other of her colleagues around Australia internationally, spreading over about 12, 14 years, of the effectiveness of RTMS in the treatment of difficult to treat depression. And it was only a few years before we actually set up the first clinic that the TGA approved it for that specific use. So it is a slow process.
Rabbi, can I just...
Yeah.
Can I just come in here in two areas?
And one of them, Peter, that will be related is that there is a specific question about, in the research, what are the side effects being shown? Okay.
We actually just want to talk about these points as well.
But some statements have been made which really just need to be put in context. The first thing is, when you look at Dr. Anderson made a good point about a particular psychotic drug. When you look at the safety evidence around psilocybin and MDMA, you not only can draw from trials, but you can actually you can actually draw from recreational experience as well. And whilst we're not advocating in any way recreationally taking these medicines, The reality is that over the last 40 years, tens of millions of people have taken MDMA and psilocybin recreationally. And there's been a number of studies about safety factors associated with taking these medicines recreationally. And what they show is that MDMA, taken in pure form, and psilocybin are amongst the safest recreational drugs. The second thing is that there's now been a large number of trials which deal with the safety of these medicines in medically controlled environments. And I think the data now is so strong about safety that we've actually moved on. And that's why MDMA, for example, is in phase 3 trials, because safety is dealt with in phase 2 trials. The second point I'd like to make is that Dr. Anderson is talking about one TGA pathway, which is registered medicine. In fact, there are 2 TGA pathways. The second one is case-by-case approvals under the Special Access Scheme.
Yes, that's right.
And what I'd like to tell you today is that there's been about 25 approvals already from the TGA for doctors to use these medicines as part of psychotherapy in medically controlled environments. So the TGA is already giving approval to these medicines used in this way. Dr. Anderson is quite right. In terms of prescribable medicine registered on the Therapeutic Goods Register, it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years because the process is very slow. But that is not stopping psychiatrists applying today for TGA approval on a case-by-case basis as on registered medicine. And that's already happening.
Do you want to comment on TMS at all?
Well, I mean, TMS is showing remission rates of about 30% for people with treatment-resistant depression. So, you know, it's a good modality for people who actually don't get well from antidepressants. As I mentioned in the presentation, the science behind antidepressants is about 50 years old. So it's old medicine. And the results being achieved are about people getting well, about 33%, 35%. There is a very large meta-analysis that's been done in the UK called the STAR-D study. And that's basically showing that you've probably got about a 35% chance of getting well from your first antidepressant. When the doctor gives you a second antidepressant because the first one's not working, the chances of getting well come down by 50%. If the doctor then gives you a third antidepressant because the first 2 aren't working, the chances of getting well come down by another 50%. So, you know, I'm not knocking antidepressants because they do work for some people. But the thing we want to emphasize is they don't work for a large number of people, and they have nasty side effects, which can be very debilitating for patients.
Thank you. Just going back, there was a further question dealing with you, especially not on medicinal marijuana, and specifically the CBD oil. What is the, if anyone knows, the research on its efficacy, side effects, application? I know it's a bit of a side. Used it at all.
It's interesting because actually the research that's been done on medicinal cannabis is much less than the research that's been done on medicinal psilocybin and medicinal MDMA. I think the reason that it's become available under the Special Access Scheme is simply because some people have very beneficial reactions to it. Now, like with so many psychiatric medicines, the way it works, people don't actually understand. And that would apply to most psychiatric medicines. But the reality is a significant number of people, a large number of people are getting beneficial, results from medicinal cannabis. And that's why the TGA is allowing it, again, on a case-by-case basis.
And it's just out of a curiosity question, excuse my ignorance, is it still Schedule 9 or is it Schedule 8 now?
It's Schedule 8. But in terms of CBD oil itself, so with none of the hallucinogenic aspects, it's actually Schedule 4.
Okay, thank you.
So it's on multiple schedules. If you use it recreationally, it's Schedule 9. If you use it medicinally, it's either Schedule 8 or Schedule 4.
Thank you for that. Another question dealt with, as opposed to PTSD, the very troubling area of anxiety that seems to be growing. And I noticed that in Canada, that in one of your slides, they're doing research vis-a-vis anxiety with terminally ill. Has there been any research on anxiety specifically with this? And what has that shown?
Well, the terminally ill one's fascinating because there's now been 2 trials that have been done in America, and they really say the same thing, that people with depression and anxiety caused by a terminal illness who take psilocybin as part of therapy have remission rates in relation to the depression and anxiety of about 60 to 80%. So,
80% actually.
So it's an amazing thing to give to somebody at a really challenging period of their lives. There's a trial taking place at the moment in Australia at St Vincent's Hospital, which is also doing the same sort of study.
Very prescient. Was going to be a question about
what's particularly interesting about these people going through this incredibly challenging period of their lives is that they come out of the experience, many of them saying it's one of the top things that have ever happened to them in their lives. And it's because they go into an altered state of reality where they experience a connectedness with everything around them, which enables them when they come out to be much more philosophical about the fact that the dying process is actually just a normal part of life. And it's not something to be scared of.
Thank you for that. Can you go a little bit further on 2 issues at the St. Vincent's and Melbourne research that's going on as we speak, which is, one, is it focusing on terminally ill or more in terms of this, like PTSD and other things? And 2, I know that there was a connection with mind medicine at first, but I don't know that there is anymore. So if you could go into those 2 points.
Yeah, no, it's solely focused on depression and anxiety associated with end of life. Mind medicine has been one of the principal funders of that trial, and we remain very supportive of that trial. However, the organisation that we were supporting, which is not St Vincent's, it's another organisation called PRISM. We had issues with them, and for that reason, we withdrew future funding from PRISM. But in terms of St Vincent's Hospital and the work they're doing, we think they're fabulous. And were they ever to approach us for funding assistance, I'm sure we'd look at that really constructively.
Right, thank you. I'm going to just check for other questions. And while I'm doing that, I want to ask a personal question, which is, what was the catalyst for your interest in this subject, an artist and a philanthropist? So it wouldn't have been something that would have been necessarily on your radar.
No, not at all. I might speak to that. So basically, as you know, Rabbi, Peter and I met on a AICC mission in Israel in 2012.
Australia in Israel Chamber of Commerce trip, in case people aren't.
Israel Chamber of Commerce. That's right. And so no, I mean, neither of us had ever taken any drugs of any kind in our lives. I don't even drink alcohol or coffee, though Peter loves his coffees. But my high has generally been created by, the incredible neuroscientific benefits of singing, which is a whole other story. But yes, I mean, I was reading an article in the New Yorker by Michael Pollan, who Josephine referred to before, who wrote the book How to Change Your Mind, and he was interviewed by Norman Swan, and just that was replayed again recently. And in that article in the New Yorker, which was called The Trip Treatment, was actually talking about this New York University trial, which is a very famous trial because it had such extraordinary remission rates for patients with end-of-life anxiety. And one of the patients that was described in the article did have a lot of anxiety and a lot of intergenerational, trauma coming up, in particular in relation to the Holocaust. And so I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And so I was fascinated by this, and I thought, well, what would it be like for me to actually do this? Because I'd never been out of control before, a bit of a control freak. Peter's father had committed suicide when he was 13. So, we all carry trauma, all of us as human beings, either our own or others' traumas with us. And so we tried to get into some of the healthy patients trials at Imperial and so on when we went overseas, but we couldn't. And so we ended up being referred to a private therapist guide in the Netherlands, where these medications and treatments are legal. And we went through this experience, and it was so profoundly healing and such an extraordinary experience of oneness and connection, as Peter's already described. And given that we'd already set up 4 charities between us, and the common denominator of all disadvantage really is mental illness. You know, you can provide housing to people, you can provide choirs, you can provide a range of activities, but if you can't get people, you know, connecting with the root cause of what's causing their misery and their sadness, then it doesn't matter all the other stuff that you're providing them, because they're not actually going to get better. So we just said to one another, well, everyone deserves a chance to have access to these therapies who would qualify and be screened as appropriate for these treatments. And so that's when we set up Mind Medicine Australia. And as you know, that's our 5th, well, it's our 5th charity, and we weren't intending to start any more charities.
And I should also add, we're not in any way trying to compete with the medical profession, because all we're trying to do is broaden the treatment options available for people like Josephine, so that between the doctor and the patient, they can work out what's best for the patient and make a decision. But hopefully what will happen in the future is that doctors will talk about antidepressants, psychotherapy, other potential treatments, and they'll also talk about psychedelic-assisted therapies. And between the doctor and the patient, they'll work out what's best for the patient.
Josephine, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Look, I think that we are all always interested in new treatments that work and are safe for our patients. I did have a couple of comments to make about safety, however. I think it is true that we can draw to an extent on the data from evaluation of recreational experience of what are then illegal drugs. And I do agree that things like heroin, methamphetamine, alcohol are far more unsafe than the drugs that we're talking about. However, I have to say that as a clinician, and this would be the experience of every clinician of my years of experience, that we have all seen a steady trickle working in Sydney and probably in Melbourne as well over the years of people who have taken psychedelic drugs, usually LSD, or sometimes MDMA, recreationally, and have had what they would call bad trips and have developed what we call with them, having assessed them, post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's generally my experience that no drug is without its safety concerns, because any drug that actually causes some benefit is also likely to have some unwanted effects. So the idea, I think, about making sure that these drugs, which on the strength of it do look to be much more at the safe end, I think is an important one to emphasise. There is a precedent for this kind of thing in New South Wales and other states. As a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and paediatricians do this too, we treat a very common disorder in childhood called ADHD, occurs in about 5% of kids in Australia. Over the last 30 years, perhaps even longer, the body of evidence has built to the very robust conclusion that stimulant medications, dexamphetamine, methylphenidate, are an effective first line of treatment for the symptoms of ADHD. These drugs are highly regulated nevertheless because of their potential for doing harm, and particularly for their potential for being abused, obviously, as stimulants. And our authorities have found ways around this. So in New South Wales, for example, if you want to prescribe stimulants a lot, as you do if you're a child and adolescent psychiatrist or a paediatrician, you can acquire a special authority number in order to provide those scripts. For ADHD continuing into adulthood, which occurs in about 20% of cases, we think, kids who've had it go on to continue to have it in adulthood. Psychiatrists or neurologists can apply for a one-off authority to prescribe for that particular patient after providing quite a lot of information pertaining to the safety of prescribing in that patient and the indications. So I'm just putting that out there. People may not be aware that there is that kind of structure around being able to use medications that have got a very strong evidence base for being effective, but may be unsafe, being able to use them more safely. And I think that's what Peter was talking about with the Schedule 9 and Schedule 8 drugs. The stimulants are in the Schedule 8 category. Yes, was there anything else you wanted me to answer around that issue?
Well, here comes another, we may have time for one or two more questions, depending on the length of the answers. Here we go. Question 1, is there any published paper that anyone can recommend giving the putative mechanisms of action of many of these treatments, because there are people on the webinar with clinical qualifications that are curious?
So we have an extremely comprehensive Learn section on our website, which has numerous journal articles, studies on there, and I think that was Miriam Fromer who asked that question. And Miriam, you'd be also welcome to email us, and we can share a whole lot of papers directly with you as well.
But the easiest way into this for somebody with the clinical expertise would be to look at our rescheduling applications.
Oh, yes.
Because they are full of medical and scientific and pharmacological data, which is what the TGA requires as part of a rescheduling application, and they can be found on our website.
Oh, yes, yeah, under News, TGA tab.
Thank you. Quick question on rescheduling. Are you the focus there is actually to have it rescheduled from a 9 to an 8? Is that the major focus of the application?
Yes, but only for medical purposes and medically controlled environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Julia, we will have time for your question. Julia is a psychoanalytic psychotherapist who regularly treats people with who present with complex PTSD and other debilitating mental illnesses. And can the panel explain what kind of psychotherapies are used in conjunction with these medications and what the length of time of therapeutic engagement might be?
Yeah, just on different types of therapies, we've actually got a course that's started in January, which is designed for psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists. It's all about training therapists in the use of these modalities. As part of that course, they go through the different types of psychotherapy and the application of those different types to psychedelic assisted therapy. The course started in late January. It's a 16-week course, both online and residential. Again, if you look at our website under the CPAT tab, you'll see that the teaching faculty is extraordinary and is made up of leaders in this field from around the world. The second intake is in July, and that's already about 2/3 full. The whole purpose of this is to make sure that as and when these modalities can be used in Australia, we have properly trained therapists who know exactly how to deal with people in altered states going through these therapies.
Thank you, Peter. So what I'd like to do is, because we are approaching, at Emanuel Synagogue, we like to start on time and end on time. And so I don't want to take advantage of everyone. I want to just, thank everyone for being here and just offer this concluding remark as well. I began talking about the Torah's position on the health of our body, and also the tradition of Judaism about continuing. Torah means to teach and to learn, to continue to learn, and especially apply the best science to our life of Torah. So as we're looking to, improve physical and mental health, to end suffering and things like this, I think a lot of us, may have a drink here or a coffee there, as Peter confessed, and I do too. As it says, wine gladdens the heart, But of course, too much alcohol can be devastating and also lead to horrible addictions. I want to come back, therefore, to Josephine's point that whenever we're dealing with anything that is a medicine or a drug, they're all the same thing. They're drugs that can be used medicinally. And the issue is, how do we deal with both purity and dosage? So in other words, psychedelics that would lead to a traumatic reaction would have either been impure or would have been overdosed, or perhaps both. And I think when we're talking about drugs being used medicinally, it's very, very clear that the purity of the drug and its dosage is strictly monitored, that monitoring being done through these clinical trials that are now moving towards stage 3 overseas. And so I want to really thank Dr. Josephine Anderson and Tanya De Jong, AM, Peter Hunt, AM, for this most wonderful presentation. And for us, I think in the community, an opening into this conversation that from a personal place, I'm very, very committed to, because human health is one of the core values of Torah, and we shouldn't shut things down out of fear, but continue to learn and to grow and see how we can help with mental and physical health. We will be having a In Conversation. That's always the first or second Sunday of the month. We will be in conversation Sunday afternoon, April 14th, with George Newhouse, fabulous advocate for social justice, a lawyer, member of our synagogue, whose work focuses on First Nations, refugees, and people with disability. That's the 14th of March. That one's coming up next. And in April, we will have Julian Leeser, MP, talking about First Nations issues. And also our health breakfast will be coming up then, and probably talking about issues of anxiety and depression as well. Again, thank you everyone for participating. We're going to put this on the website. We want to get the learning out there. And so to Rob and Marina behind the scenes, making this all happen, to Tanya, Peter, and Josephine for being here this morning. Thank you very, very much. Everyone have a good day and a very safe and healthy Purim celebration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And nice to meet you, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet each and every one of you. Take care.